Sudowrite's Muse is finally available to all Sudowrite subscribers, so I thought I would make this video to really put Muse to the test and see just how good at writing creative prose it is. So let's get into it. So for those who are unaware, Sudowrite has created their own fine-tuned model that is specifically designed for creative writing, for literary fiction. And there's a bunch of questions that I'll answer at the end of this video. But the main thing I want to talk about is it actually good at writing? Now, if you've been following this channel for the last couple of months, I've been creating all of these qualitative creative writing assessments of every single model. Well, not every single model, because it takes a while to make these things, but all of the recent models that have come out, I have put those through these tests. I use the same prompts every single time for every model. And for every test, I have brainstorming tests, I have prose writing tests, I have tests for marketing use cases for authors, and it's just a good way of trying to use an equal footing to really determine which models are best for creative writing and which are not. Muse, however, has been specifically designed for creative writing, and so it should, in theory, be really good at this. But there's a problem, and the problem is I can't actually use all of the same prompts that I use in my typical rubrics for these models. I can't use those prompts exactly inside of Sudowrite. Because for one, Sudowrite has its own interface, its own way of doing things, and you cannot interact with these models like you can with any other chatbot. Additionally, these models have been specifically designed for certain tasks. These models are not meant to be brainstorming models, they are meant to be prose writing models. And in fact, the different use cases inside of Sudowrite have been trained slightly differently. There's not actually just one model inside of Sudowrite. There's not one Muse model. There are actually several that have all been slightly tweaked for different use cases. And way back when I was making videos about fine-tuning models, that's the way it was then. You want to fine-tune a model to do one specific kind of thing. And that's the only way you could get it to do anything halfway decent. So these models are quite the same way. And let me just show you a little bit inside of Sudowrite how Muse works. There are 3 places currently where you can use Muse. The first is in a chapter generator, which looks something like this. You put in your scenes here and then hit generate. But before you hit generate, you have to make sure you're using the correct model, which looks like this. So you just select Muse. You can actually put an example of your style in here as well. If you wanted to write a little bit more like you can control the creativity, which is essentially another word for temperature. If you're familiar with temperature on other models, usually I want this sort of right in the center-ish. And then it will actually go through and write the entire scene and potentially the entire chapter out for you. Each scene usually is between 1,000 to 2,000 words, and you might have 2 or 3 scenes inside of one chapter. Now, the other way to do it is to use the write feature. So in this case, you would come to the end of your manuscript, come up here and hit guided write. Before you do that, you want to make sure your settings are correct. So go to write settings, select the number of cards you want. This is if you wanted to write something multiple times to give you a diversity of options that you can choose from. You can choose to have more. I usually just go with 1, and if I don't like the results, I'll just generate it again. This way I know that I'm only going to be getting 1 result and only going to be charged for that 1 result. You can select the length of the cards. I recommend between either 250 words or 500 words. Key details, I don't really need these most of the time. This is sort of a carryover feature from the way Sudowrite used to be. It's not as important anymore. And then you can also adjust the creativity as well. I've left it at the default here. So from there, you go to guided write, and then you'll hit enter, and it'll write those next couple hundred words. I found this to be my favorite way of doing it, and because it gives you a little bit more control over things. But like I mentioned, this is actually a different model compared to the chapter generator. And what I found, at least in my tests, is that you can kind of tell. You can tell that the chapter generator is a slightly different model because it had little quirks that doing it through the guided write feature doesn't do. You can also, if you don't want to give it guidance, you just want to see where it wants to go, which with the case of Muse is actually sometimes something I often like to do because Muse tends to be a lot more creative and can sometimes have some really interesting directions where it goes. In that case, you would just select auto and just press this button right So if we press that right now, it'll pull up the words here on the side. So it literally ends like battling despair, Haldred clawed at the heavy doors with bloodied fingers. Please, he shouted again, and his body shook with the effort. So it literally starts immediately after the end of the last couple of words here. And if you like this, you can go ahead down here and select insert or just copy and paste it into there. If it wasn't a good generation, you can hit the thumbs up or thumbs down button, however you want. So that's how you use it in the guided write feature. There's one other instance where you can use Muse, and that is to expand. So let's say I didn't like this sentence. I want to expand it. I want to maybe include a little more action, a little more dialogue, or what have you. I could just come here and hit expand. And once again, over here on the side, it will take that sentence and create something from it. It does have context awareness of what's going on before. So it did expand it for me. Not a whole lot, but definitely like proportionally a good maybe 3 or 4 times what the original text was. So that's just something that you can use Muse for as well. And currently those are the 3 use cases for Muse: the chapter generator, the write feature, and the expand feature. If they wanted to incorporate Muse into other things, they would have to basically create an entirely new model that is fine-tuned to do those things. For instance, I would love it if they could come up with something that could do the chapter outline and do it well. I've already told them they need to get 3.7 Sonnet in there, because if you saw my video about 3.7 Sonnet, you'll know that I found it to be absolutely the best LLM for outlining specifically. And so definitely something to keep in mind. But right now, it's not using Muse in their outlining section because they would essentially have to create an entirely new version of Muse that works for outlines. So that's the way it works. And because of that, I can't put all of my prompts through Muse in the same way I would with any other chat-based interface model, right? So if you go look at my comparison chart here that I've created, I've entered Sudowrite's Muse in here. I've put the date, but then I put like not applicable in a lot of these different fields because I either don't know it or it's just not something I can do with this. For instance, Sudowrite doesn't make all of their information public about things like what the context window is, what the max output is, the input and the output. I mean, we get some information about the cost of it by just looking at how many credits it's using up, and they have brought the cost down. Earlier days of Muse, I've been beta testing this thing for a while. It was 3 times as expensive as it is now in terms of how many credits it used. But one of the great things about Muse is that it absolutely can do not safe for work content. In fact, it can do very not safe for work content. I won't tell you all of the tests I ran it through, but yes, it can do not safe for work content. Absolutely no problem. But I put not applicable here under all of my brainstorming prompts because those aren't really applicable. Same with the marketing prompts. And I'm also putting not applicable for the overall score because if I can't test it on all of those things, then I can't really give it a score. So really the only thing that we are talking about in this analysis is how well does it write prose. Even then, though, I have to shift my prompting techniques a little bit because, again, this is not a chat interface, so I can't interact with it in the same way that I would with ChatGPT or Claude or any of the others. So I'll explain how I do that. I just want to get that out of the way first to understand that this is not as equal in terms of the prompts and everything that I'm using as I can do with the other models. This is really only testing for Prose. And it's only testing based on, like, I'm doing my best to make sure that the prompts are similar as possible. But I did have to, like, make a few changes in order to make it work with Muse. So that's just a big caveat there. That said, let's take a look at some of the output that it gave me. I did use the same scenes that I've been using for all of these others. And for the basic prose prompt, I got all of this. As you can see, I've highlighted quite a bit of it in green, meaning that I liked it. Most of the prose here I thought was really good. As you can see, most of it is highlighted in green. I'll go ahead and pause the video and read it if you want to. But this was the basic prose prompt. It did fine. For the more complicated prose prompt, this is actually where I used the chapter generator. So the first one, I was just using the write feature, the guided write feature, and I just put it in a couple of beats at a time to get about 500 words. As you can see from this analysis, I got 519 words for that basic prose prompt. For the more complicated prose prompt, normally I would take a novel crafter prompt and stick it into a chat bot. But in this case, I can't interact with it like a chatbot. And so what I did is I gave it the whole chapter. I gave it the chapter summary to go on, and I gave it the information about the characters, and I gave it a sample chapter of my work, about 1,000 words of my own work to analyze, which is, for the most part, the same elements that I using the novel crafter prompt. I just had to do it in Sudowrite's way because that's just how it worked. That's the only way I could get it in there. And it created this long thing. Now, I intentionally asked it to do the full chapter rather than just a portion of the chapter because I just wanted to see how well that would do. And so, again, this is not as comparable to the other prompts in this category. But as you can see, this one is pretty strongly highlighted in green as well. Although I found that the chapter generator was not quite as good from a prose standpoint as using it in the guided write. Because they are two slightly different models. They're very closely related, but they are technically different models that are being used there. And this one I found to have a couple of quirks that it would do frequently that I didn't like. I'll give you an example. Very often it would end a sentence, it would have a comma, and then it would have a clause. We could call this like the superfluous clause or something like that if it comes up again, where it would just sort of add something that wasn't really necessary. Like the meaning was already across from the previous part of the sentence, and there was usually just something superfluous in there that didn't need to be included. Like, for instance, and he could feel the ghosts of his long companions around him, comma, accusing and silent. And sometimes these superfluous clauses can work if they add something unique and extra meaning to the sentence, but sometimes it just didn't feel necessary. So for instance, this sentence, if he could just reach the city, if they could just open the gates, his mind latched onto the thought, comma, a lifeline against the surrounding void. Just superfluous. I don't need that. We could completely cut it entirely. He blinked, almost disbelieving, then renewed his pace, the vision propelling him forward. Again, not really necessary. We already know that he renewed his pace. We don't really need to know that he's being propelled forward because we saw that. We saw the vision he had, and then we saw him renew his pace. And so we don't need to say again that the vision propelled him forward because that was already said, right? This is what I mean by the superfluous clause. I'll see if I can find another example here. Here's one. He could almost hear the mutter of civilization from within, a promise of refuge. Once again, it's like a comma and then a sort of addendum to the sentence. It's almost like Muse is not capable of being okay with the sentence as it is. Like it feels like it has to add on a little something else to make it good. This was a small issue, clearly you can see the whole thing is marked up in green. So clearly I liked most of it, but this is just the sort of thing that I would, if I were reading through it and polishing it, I would fix. Either remove entirely, change it. There are going to be some occasions where the superfluous clause fits, but you need to use your judgment to know, like, when is it adding something that wasn't already said. Then I had it run through the dialogue prose template, which I used the same technique using the write feature that I did on the basic prose template, but just with a different scene that had dialogue in it. And as you can see, I really like this one as well. It was also mostly in green, although this one was a little shorter than the past ones. And then we have the editing prose template. This one I also did differently because, once again, because this is not a chat feature, I can't say, here is some text, can you improve the writing on it, please? Instead, I have to use one of the three features that Sudowrite offers, which is either the write feature, the chapter generator, or the expand feature. And so for this one, I decided to use the expand feature. I took the original text that I wanted to improve in the editing, and usually with old AI text, it's very often kind of condensed anyway. If I were to go through and edit it, I would probably be adding a lot more in terms of deep point of view and show don't tell and stuff like that, which usually does result in an expanded text. And so I thought, well, why don't we just try using expand on this? So I did, and this is what it ended up giving me. Once again, lots of green, okay? Not everything. Like this last part I thought was just not necessary. Couple of bits in here where it was doing that same superfluous clause thing, like he intoned with deliberate calm. First of all, never use the word intoned as a dialogue tag. You can use he said or he asked most of the time, like 90% of the time, because readers' eyes just sort of gloss over those. And if you use a word like intoned, that's going to like trip them up. So overall, great. Still in need of a minor bit of editing, but like far less than I would need for other things. So let's look at the actual comparisons in terms of the number of words that I got. For the basic prose prompt, I got 519 words, 445 of which were viable. And the real one to test this against is Claude 3.7 Sonnet, which I think of all of the other models is the best for prose. It wasn't a huge improvement over 3.5s on it, but it was an improvement, and it's also better than GPT 4.5, like by a long shot. So I was comparing it against that. For that one, the basic prose prompt wrote 415 words, 346 of which were viable. So it's pretty close, but in terms of total overall words and in terms of a total percentage of the words that were written, Muse definitely wins here. The same is also true. Well, it's actually about neck and neck for the complex prose prompt. I was working with more words here, 994, and it gave me 698 words that I thought were usable. Again, this one, the chapter generator, did not feel as good to me as with the guided write feature. So as a percentage, it's not quite as high as the basic prose prompt, but still really high, and probably neck and neck. If I were to compare the percentage of these two together, it would probably be very close. Somebody out there could do the math on that for me. And then for the dialogue prose prompt, I got not quite as many words, 368, but 324 were viable, which is an insanely high percentage. And then for the editing prose prompt, as always, the original text that I was asking it to improve was 349 words, 101 of which I thought were viable. And this, using the expand feature, expanded it to 500 words exactly, which was great. And 388 of that was viable. So I thought this was actually really good. This is actually the best that I've seen in terms of percentage wise. Actually, 3.7 Sonnet got really close as well, but I thought this was pretty good in terms of expanding it to be a better scene. So overall, definitely one of the best prose prompts out there. But I'm going to show you, like, from my test, running it through these tests, I was finding it to be a little bit unnatural. And that's the thing with Sudowrite and using Sudowrite's Muse. You can't really use it the way you've been using other models. And so I'm going to show you right now how I use it and what that looks like. Because the way I do it, I get by far the best results out of it, but it's a totally different way than I've been using other LLMs. With other LLMs, I'm trying to do this whole like rigid structure and focus very heavily on the prompts, but with Muse, it's much more of a free-flowing creativity kind of thing. So let's go into that. Before I get to that, I want to also put a shout out for my Story Hacker Gold membership, which you can find a link to down below. We actually just had James Yu, who's the co-founder of Sudowrite, just last week. He came over and talked to us about Muse and gave my students early access to it. So there are a lot of benefits like that you'll get when you come into the group. You'll get to meet really cool people. You'll get my step-by-step course, which takes you from having nothing to having not just a book, but also a email list, and have everything published and marketed and just everything you need. Plus you get almost daily Zoom calls. I go in there once a week. I've got a developmental editor that would teach you good principles of storytelling, so you can understand, like, how do I know which words are viable here? How am I coming up with these numbers? What makes good prose? How do I know when AI is not being a good prose writer and when it is? That's the sort of thing we cover in those classes. We have a guy who is working on teaching graphic design and AI art for authors. So if you're interested in that, and then we have 2 accountability calls every week where you can come in and share your goals and share your progress. And those are honestly, in my opinion, the most important of the classes that we do. So if that's interesting to you, then I would encourage you to go check out the link down below and get started there, and hopefully I'll see you. So let's go through in Sudowrite and I will show you exactly what I mean, how I work with this. I'm going to use the same scene, but I've got it sort of just in my head. I'm not going to be using pre-established prompts. I know the action that's supposed to happen in my head, and so I'm just going to use that and work with it from a personal creativity standpoint. So we're not going to use this chapter generator. Instead, we're going to be using the guided write feature. Again, we want to go to write settings, make sure we got the right number of cards here. I'm going to leave this at 1. I'm going to actually bring this to 250 words because I want a little bit more fine-tuned control of the overall of this. And we want to make sure the prose is set to Muse right here. So use Muse. I'm going to leave these key details unfilled, but just so everyone's aware, we do have a few things filled out in the story Bible. Not a lot, but enough. For instance, here in the genre, it's listed as just epic fantasy. And then under characters, I've got Haldred and Lathan, 2 of the characters that we'll see. Actually, we'll probably just see Haldred in this demonstration. And then currently have nothing in world building, but we also don't really need that at this point because I'm going to be providing all of the details that it needs. First thing I do is I usually write a sentence or 2 because I found that the guided write feature works better when it's not starting from scratch. So I like to give it this first sentence. And then all I do is go here to guided write, and then we're going to just insert what happens in these first 250 words or so. So let's say the man's name is Haldred, and he's returning from an expedition that had disastrous results. His clothes are tattered, his canteen empty, and his shoes are a bloody mess of rags. I will just go to that point. And that's probably more detail than I usually put in these things. All right, so we got a little bit here. It didn't quite write as much as I would like it to. But that's okay. The storm shifted and Haldred appeared, a specter in tatters against the churning sky. His cloak flapped wildly, reduced to shreds, clinging to his shoulders. A grimy hand reached for the canteen in his belt, shaking it with a grimace as nothing met his ears but the hollow sound of hope long gone. Probably get rid of that. The ground sucked at his feet with every step, his boots worn to a bloody mass of rags barely holding together, leaving a large trail in the muck. Memory flashed like lightning, companions lost to nameless things in the shadows, their screams swallowed by the same unending storm. Each lash of rain felt a blow from that failure, yet he pressed on, head down, sunken eyes, some distant point. Forward was all that remained. Another thing that I neglected to do but should have done here is make sure that this is connected to our outline. So let me do that now. We'll just connect it to chapter 1. So now it at least knows the context of the outline and what happens in this chapter. That'll help guide it in the correct direction just a little bit. So we'll go to the next one now. I would go through and edit this. In fact, this is short enough. Let me edit this for you so you can see the kind of things that I would do. A speck of tatters in the churned sky. So actually, we already had that alone figure, and Haldred, well, I'm going to rewrite the rest of the sentence. Choked, his nostrils finally clear of the sand, blowing sand. His cloak flapped wildly, reduced to shreds. Grimy hand reached for the canteen in his belt, shaking it with a grimace as nothing met his ears but the hollow sound of hope long gone. This is a little bit over dramatic, but the hollow sound, hollow, like him. And we'll do a new paragraph here. The ground sucked at his feet with every step, his boots worn to a bloody mess of rags barely holding together, leaving a dark trail in the muck. Memory flashed like lightning. We don't need. Muse does tend to do a lot of metaphors, only some of which are useful. Companions lost to nameless things in the shadows, their screams swallowed by the same unending storm. Each lash of rain felt a blow from that failure, yet he pressed on, head down, sunken eyes set on some distant point. Forward was all that remained. A little overdramatic, but I think we can leave it. So now we go to the guided right, and I'll just do the next bit. Haldred continues on for some time, but hears a sound that stops him in his tracks. Again, pretty short and simple. I'm not trying to explain the whole scene here. Okay, it didn't do a great job here with this one. It introduced a new character. This can sometimes happen because it is much more creative. So I'm just going to downvote that one. I hit this again and continues on. I'll just add alone for some time, but here's the sound that stops him in his tracks. I'll clarify. He turns to see the hungry. Okay, this looks good. His foot slipped. He hit the ground hard. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the unforgiving sky, letting the rain pummel his face. See, I love some of the details like this. It really gets us into the head of the character. All of the other LLMs that I've worked with would not have a detail like this, where he's like slipping and falling and feeling things and all of that. It would just go directly with the instructions that I gave it without taking any creative liberties. And here it is taking a creative liberty, and often in ways that work. Sometimes not, but often in ways that actually add something unique to the scene. A laugh, harsh as the wind, escaped him. Harsh as the wind, I don't really care for, but we can probably leave that for now. There was little else to do but continue. With great effort, he forced himself upright again and moved forward on limbs that felt like breaking. Each step required more than he thought he had left, each breath shallow and desperate against the blinding sheets of rain. Something cut through the chaos of the storm, a sound, unnatural. It stopped him dead in his tracks, heart pounding, an uneven tattoo in his chest. He turned slowly, fear making his movements sluggish, fighting against the hope that he'd made it beyond this cursed land, but they were there, dark shades scattered across the horizon like insects trailing from a nest. The hungry. A cruel smile tugged at his lips. As he faced them, he knew there would be no escape. We don't need he knew. So this is an example of not being in deep point of view. We can just completely remove this entirely and just go with there would be no escape, because we don't need to say that he knew that there would be no escape when we could just share his thought. There will be no escape. So that's the kind of thing that I would edit here. Another thing that I noticed is that because there's a storm, it naturally thought that we were talking about a rainstorm. So I need to make it clear here that this is actually a sandstorm. And that's, pretty easily edited. But those are the kind of like content errors that you will want to watch for. So using Muse is certainly not perfect. It's great at what it does, but it requires its own form of engineering to get it to work. Before I get into my final thoughts, I just want to go through a couple of frequently asked questions that I've heard about this model and just answer those to the best of my ability. First, is this going to be available outside of Sudowrite? The answer, and I got this directly from the developer himself, is that is not on the foreseeable roadmap. They might change their mind on that in the future because it could be an alternative revenue source, but I totally get why it would be a important thing to have it as an exclusive to Sudowrite, because from a business perspective, that just makes sense. But also because every time it's used, you're using a slightly different fine-tuned model. If whether you're using it in the guided write section or in the chapter generator, those are different models and they're specifically designed to do one thing. So if you were to use it outside of Sudowrite, you would almost want to also have Sudowrite's prompts and everything that they're doing so that you can only use it the way they use it. Because it's not going to respond in a chatbot situation. You can't ask it for ad headlines or an SEO article or for brainstorming. You just can't do that. So I get why it would be exclusive to the architecture that Sudowrite has designed here. The second question is it available in other languages besides English? The answer to that is currently no. This has been fine-tuned specifically for the English language. Once again, they'd have to create essentially a new model for every language that they would want to create. Maybe that's something that they're hoping to do somewhere down the line, but that will probably be a later thing. Next question is it available on all of the Sudowrite plans? And the answer is yes. If you are, let's say we're doing monthly here. If you want to get the most out of it, I would recommend the professional tier. You can absolutely start at the hobby student tier here to get used to it and to see how you like it. But I found that these credits here, 225,000 of them, will go very quickly. And for $19 a month, you might as well just pay 10 more to get, 4 times the same amount of credits, or twice that to get twice the amount of credits. This is actually what I'm using. I ended up investing in the 59 tier only because I'm actually using this stuff for my own books. I got this one because the credits roll over for 12 months. So it's kind of useful from that perspective. Plus you get 2 million a month. And so this one's more for power users. I'd say for most of you, if you're serious about using it, go with the 29 a month. If you just want to test it to see if it works for you and your process, then go ahead and try the $19 one for a month and then upgrade after that. But it is available on all of these tiers. Last question is, does Muse do nonfiction? Depends on what kind of nonfiction you're talking about. If it's creative nonfiction, which has a more narrative fiction-like flow, then yes, you can do creative nonfiction. If it's more like an article for your website or a self-help book or something like that, it will not do that kind of nonfiction. That's just not how it's designed. But if you're doing a memoir or some other kind of creative nonfiction, it can do that. And that is it. That said, this is by far the best prose writing model that I have ever worked with. Like, by far, not even close. It's not a competition. And because of how easy it is to use, especially when I'm doing it in this format where I just sort of edit as I go and then write the next little bit, but not give it too many details, it goes so much faster. And my process of writing prose with this whole technique is significantly increased. I can sometimes get 3,000-4,000 words in an hour done this way, sometimes more depending on the nature of the scene, because sometimes it understands certain things better than others, and those things require less editing. And so it does really, really well. It does not safe for work content better than any other of the open source models out there. It just has a lot going for it. So if you're interested in learning more about it and trying it out, I do have an affiliate link down below. Once again, I am actively using this for my own books. And so I try to only recommend tools that I'm actively using myself or that I would in under the right circumstances. So check that out down below if you're interested. I also do have a full video going over everything that you need to know about Sudowrite. I did talk about Muse briefly in there, but when I made it, it was still in beta. Everything else to tutorials on how to create everything you need to do inside of Sudowrite. So go check that video out and I will see you in the next one.